Good evening, Canby. Welcome to the July 24th Planning Commission session. We'll go ahead and get started this evening with our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And our first consent item is the review and approval of draft meeting minutes for July 25th, 2022. I'd like to have a roll call vote starting to my right with Commissioner Ellison.
I'd like to have a motion.
I'm sorry, I'd like to get a motion. Thank you so much.
I move we accept the minutes of July 25th, 2022.
I second.
Very well, we'll start with Commissioner Ellison.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Very well, the draft meeting minutes for July 25th, 2022 has been approved. Moving on to citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to questions raised during citizens' input before the meeting ends or as quickly as possible thereafter. Do we have any citizen input on non-agenda items? Seeing none, we will move on to new business. We have none. And public hearings this evening, we have none. That brings us to our work session. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to discuss housing efficiency measures Part 2. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite the public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the two opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decisions in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Don Hardy to talk about housing efficiency measures Part 2. Take it away, Don.
Good evening, Chair Ellison and Commissioners. We are continuing our discussion on housing efficiency measures tonight, and I just wanted to give kind of an overview, and I'll turn it over to Reed Stapleton with Dowell. Also, Emma Poracola will also be speaking tonight on infill, which is at the back end of this, the long-awaited, and Commissioner Ewart is missing it tonight, infill discussion. He'll have to watch the tape. So the three parts we're going to be covering before the infill will be cottage developments, planning developments, and commercial, allowing residential and commercial areas, specifically along south side of 99E, where they're currently not permitted in a way that is conducive to promoting housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Reed to get into the presentation. I'd like this to be, again, interactive. This kind of a framework, I think that's important, is this will lead to Dowell preparing a scope of work that they'll be providing to city staff, and we'll be reviewing that, and then from there we'll be diving into code language. So tonight is a framing session. We value your input tonight, and this doesn't, you may not have answers to everything, you may not have suggestions to everything, but even observations would be helpful tonight. So just with that, I'll turn it over to Reed.
Thank you, Don. Members of the Commission, nice to see you again. So we are, as Don alluded to, at the sort of the tail end of this first phase of work, which was primarily looking at what are examples of cottage clusters that we've seen in other communities, and then doing an evaluation of the city's code to identify what are some of the possible areas of adjustment that might need to happen in the code to better accommodate those in the realm of this housing efficiencies concept. And so So what I'll do tonight is just run through what our first kind of observations are of code and areas that I think would warrant further evaluation in this next phase, and really look forward to your input on, are there things that we haven't thought of or other areas of code evaluation that you think really should be considered while the city engages in that process. Next slide, please. So this is, again, just kind of a recap. I'll give a little bit of an overview of the code, and then I think Emma's going to speak to the infill opportunities around downtown. Next slide, please. And then this is, if you're going to need to toggle through this, but thank you. So the first concept that we think is going to require some discussion when it comes to allowing cottage clusters is considering a decrease in the minimum lot size. Obviously, with the cottage clusters and the examples that we've shown, the concept and the design concept behind them are often they're smaller lots, but there's a communal open space. And so, the traditional single-family residential lot where everyone has their own yard and everything's kind of, included within that lot is a little bit different with that concept. And so, some exploration of decreasing minimum lot sizes, I think, is warranted. You can advance, please. Thank you. As an example, the current minimum lot size in the city in R1 and R5 ranges from 7,000 to 10,000 square feet. Typically what we've seen with the cottage cluster examples are anything from 1,000, which would obviously be extremely small, but up to 6,000 square feet. So there needs to be some consideration of what's the right size, and I'm not looking to determine any of that now, but I think in this next phase of work, I think there'll need to be some discussion about where do we land on that. We'll need to consider some reduction in minimum width and frontage, and if you advance again, thank you. So current minimum width and frontage is 60 feet. Typical cottage clusters the ones that we've seen range between 30 and 40 feet. Again, the orientation concept's a little bit different. They're not typically fronting out onto a street. It's more often on a common courtyard or common open space area. I think there's what we've seen are your street yard and rear yard setbacks are, again, a little different because of the orientation of those units. And so some different scheme, different dimensional standard is probably appropriate for those, and that's something that we'd want to explore. And you can, thank you.
The minimum in frontage is 60 feet, is the
Thank you. When we say that the current minimum width and frontage is 60 feet, is that actually a square footage? Is it like so much width and depth? Because
no, that's a lineal number. So
the
that's
widths.
Yes, exactly.
Specifically, okay. Thank you.
And then next, sorry, can you advance? Thank you. So, and then, some consideration of increasing the maximum impervious surface per lot may make sense, again, because with the cottage clusters, the lots are shrinking, but the common open space is compensating. And so maybe if you look at it holistically, each unit is having the same amount of open space that they might have if it were in their backyard, but because it's not in the lot, the amount of impervious per lot would be a greater percentage. Current maximum is 60%. Typical cottage cluster might require a little bit more impervious surface internal to the lot, understanding that would be compensated for external to the lot. Commissioner Jaros, you look like you have a question? No? Okay. Next slide, please. So R-zone issues that need to be addressed. So allowed uses, obviously, we need to make some adjustments to allow for cottage clusters as a use within the R1 and R5 zones. And then the design standards need to be addressed. We'll need to look at what are the minimum dimensional standards, setbacks, parking, maximum impervious surface, all of those dimensional standards that go into the on-site design and the neighborhood design. And I think we'll need to talk about, are those standards couched and housed within the residential zone itself, or is there potentially a separate section devoted to that is sort of detoured through as you work through the code? So kind of there'll be some code structural issues that we'll need to work through to figure out what makes the most sense there. And then, of course, what are the amenities that need to be required? So, I think there have been some examples that have been shown where the quote-unquote courtyard is almost sort of a centralized driveway, and I think examples like that are ones that we'd want to look at to say, well, is that really a cottage cluster concept if everyone's just feeding off of that driveway and we're calling the driveway the open space, or is there really a different requirement where it's clearly landscaped and it's active recreational space? And so we'll want to tease out those types of concepts of what's the recreational component, what's the landscape component, and that sort of thing.
A couple of things that I just finally found the title for that kind of feed into this a little bit. One was that article about how Austin, Texas, that they have actually reduced the minimum lot size for R1 to 2,500 square feet. And that's in Texas, where they tend to think in terms of big and who cares what goes next to next in a lot of places. But Austin is kind of a standout, a place where a lot of younger people are moving to, and it's a college kind of community. And so they're kind of looking a little bit forward. And then the other article, which I sent you a little thing about, is talking about climate-friendly and equitable communities. Are you familiar with that?
To some degree, yeah, please continue.
Okay, no, it's just one of the things is that one of the main thrust of it is to reduce parking requirements within a certain distance of transportation. And what it terms as transportation is fairly wide, but it was showing the maps of a lot of, mid-sized communities that showed, huge areas where state rules kind of superseded local parking requirements. And as far as the requirements for businesses and residences were concerned, they were just a lot of, there's, I guess, 14 local lawsuits, or 14 local governments filed one lawsuit that they're challenging the entire issue, but a lot of municipalities are just kind of going with it and saying, well, once we reduce the parking requirements, then all of a sudden more lots become available and frontage becomes less important. And, but it's kind of I think it's another thing that where the state is trying to just take the fight out of the local communities and make it easier. The easiest path is to just lighten your options. And I think that there's one thing that the article said, that there was other options that you could take in addition, instead of just blanket reducing the number of parking per lot, but they were quite complicated and there was a lot of hoops to jump through to do those options. And so a lot of municipalities are just deciding not to. And that kind of makes a lot of these things a little bit easier to manage if we are indeed subject to those things.
Are those municipalities that don't have any kinds of transit service to nearby businesses and amenities?
Well, that's like the ones that are in it are Corvallis, Westland. There's some of the ones that they're, Ashland, Lake Oswego, or the municipalities that are just saying we're just going to go with what the new rules are. But there are, that it tends to be the smaller communities that are along a highway where there's nothing to it but what's along the highway. And so they really feel like they have plenty of space and have no option but to comply. And they tend to not want to. But, as we've talked about, where we seem to have a surplus of parking in a lot of our industrial properties, it seems like an ongoing conversation, although in the past, it's always been about how can we maximize it. It's a very thriving conversation. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in since we were kind of talking about, with smaller zone sizes, smaller frontages, cottage clusters, and the parking, maybe taking up a lot of space in the middle, and it's like, they're trying to minimize these things, and you may have to shop for your parking first and foremost when you go looking for a place to buy.
Commissioner Hutchinson, all good points. Just wanted to thank you for sharing that information. I didn't send it on to Reed. I probably should have, but I wanted to respond on a couple of those items. Canby is kind of in a unique position. I confirmed with the parking person that's a manager at DLCD. And so on the one hand, Canby is not subject to those regulations. We're not in Metro, and I know some of those other jurisdictions that are about the size of Canby are subject to them. They have Metro organizations in their jurisdictions. With that being said, these housing efficiency measures are being proposed to be concurrent with an urban growth boundary expansion, which gives Department of Land Conservation and Development ultimate review authority over these items. And there is a push, I would say, on affordability for sure about reducing parking. So that conversation is part of this. We're covering this a high level tonight, but that is something that we will be hearing more about in future work sessions. We're probably going to have DLCD staff come here and explain that further, but these efficiency measures are really intended to somewhat maximize our ability to have development in the city without increasing the urban growth boundary, which we know is very likely going to be needed anyway for the 20-year population projection. So even though we're not subject to the state regulations on climate-friendly regulations, there is at least a perception that, and if not a reality, that adding more parking is an increased cost. And when we're trying to end up creating more affordable housing, having more parking pretty much goes against that. I would say there also is a market reality that we're trying to balance with that, which is what will people buy? And having zero parking in Canby will likely not be a selling factor. So I think there's this range of perspective here that's all being brought in as we do these efficiency measures. We're also tapping into those that are interested in cottage developments and what are they planning to do. And it can be, if there was such an ordinance developed, what would that look like and what would the parking situation look like in their scenario, which should be market tested versus kind of conceptual level. So that is part of what we're talking about tonight at a high level is perhaps there is a minimum of one parking space, but there's no maximum parking, for example, per unit, so per house. And that's probably more likely where Department of Land Conservation and Development will end up landing. I think continuing with the notion that there'll be 2 parking spaces for every house may not fly with DLCD. And so I'm just throwing that out there, and that would mean that would jeopardize our ability to do an expansion of our urban growth boundary. So these all have to be weighed out together with that. The other article that you provided for Austin, and just wanted to make a pretty strong clarification here, we're not really seeing this as being necessarily ubiquitous like Austin, where your zoning now, for all intents and purposes, is everywhere across the entire city. You now have different kind of densities that are allowed. We're looking at this more as targeted areas for cottage developments, planned unit developments. So what are those like minimum lot sizes? What are the criteria to even be able to be eligible for this? You may have the right zoning, but the idea behind it is it would have some size to it. A single lot, or 2 lots even for that matter, is not big enough to accomplish this. And there's also provisions already in our code for accessory dwelling units and also House Bill 2001, which addresses the ability to put two houses on one lot. That's kind of, the future discussion that Emma's going to have, at the very tail end of this presentation, and like what would that even look like, and is there even the potential for doing much of that in the city? But that's permitted. So all these have to kind of play in, but for tonight, we're looking kind of for the high-level items that, what are the thoughts around parking, for example, and we'll be drilling down into that further. It is a cost variable, I believe, but there's also, like I said, a market reality where, I don't see us getting to a zero parking situation where all parking is on a street. I don't think that's what Canby really is about, really, essentially, but could there be a unique way of putting parking together in the cottage development area where everybody's on the same page about this is a development, it's being master planned, and you're buying into that community. So there could be a combination of both on-street and off-street parking that could be in there. As Reed has shown in previous examples, there could be a common parking area for all the vehicles in these as well. So it may not be every home has a driveway. So those are part of that discussion as well.
Just to chime in real quick, just something I'd like for us all to keep in mind when we're thinking about parking, what we're willing to allow or disallow. You'll hear frequently from people in in Canby, that this isn't Portland. We don't want it to be like Portland. But Portland has cars lining both sides of 20-foot wide streets, all the way down, one car down a street in one direction at the same time, but they're two-way streets and cars are trying to come down at the same time. You have like no visibility, making turns, you can't see around cars. And here in Canby, it's a little bit more complicated because most people drive pretty large vehicles. I would say, there's only 1 out of 4 or 5 vehicles that's a sedan. The rest of them are large trucks and SUVs, which even just with the parking lot, the parking space dimensions that we use for retail, you'll see that trucks and SUVs are parked and 3 foot of their butt sticking out into the drive path because those spots are for little cars and the cars in Canby are not little cars. And so that just makes it that much more complicated in terms of width and the depth of the vehicles that are parking then on both sides of skinny streets in these smaller established neighborhoods. So when we're looking at the areas that we're talking about zoning, especially for the R2 zones, but then when we're looking at these R1 and 1.5 zones that we might be shifting, if we're too liberal with we want to entice developers and say we're going to have these short frontages and we're only going to require this really small amount of parking, or count a garage as a parking space, and there's, those streets are going to be completely lined. People are going to have to walk for 6 or 7 blocks from wherever they find a spot to their house, and that's really going to have a negative impact on just kind of like the community's vibe, for lack of a better word. Like, it's not going to be fun to visit your neighbors or take your kid to somebody else's house or to go anywhere in town, because then it's like Portland, and that's going to just start, it's going to be bad for people in a lot of ways, and I don't know that personally I'd like to see that happen just at the expense of getting a couple tiny houses in to say, hey, we're meeting this requirement. Like, is that our best way necessarily? So
Commissioner Driscoll, all good stuff, and I think what I would like to, as we continue the dialogue, I think what's important here is that these would be largely, in my view, it would not be like infill situations where you have already pre-existing streets that may not be very wide. This may go against what kind of the concept that DLCD is thinking about, but I mean, we want complete streets that are city standard streets. I think that's a premise here, that we would not be like saying, okay, in addition to reducing the parking, we want to do super narrow streets. That, in my opinion, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about standardized streets with, bike lanes and sidewalks on both sides, meeting city standards, and a master plan community. So, these cottage developments, so essentially, is it going to be more compact than perhaps like near the downtown? It might look that way, but I think it still could function. And I think many of the examples that were shown previously, again, I think they work pretty well. I don't, it wasn't like overcrowded. I get what you're saying, but please don't go to Portland immediately on visualization, because that is a different scenario altogether. I mean, because it is really crowded and it's very dense. So it's kind of somewhere, this is where we need to kind of start, maybe as we go further into this, is like, okay, my suggestion is we talk about the parameters, we bring back graphics of what that might look like, and then we start going down that path to say this is what it is. I think keeping the affordability is really important as well, though. Like, what is the aspirational goal here? So there is a give and take, but if we do nothing, there's going to be zero affordability. I mean, so it's kind of like, where do we land in that spectrum on this? And so those all have to play in. But again, back to Commissioner Hutchinson, I don't think that we're really, like, the concentration is not on infill. It would be greenfield areas. They may be, I'm just throwing numbers out, 5 or 10 acres, whatever that parameter is. You have to have a minimum of this. It has to have open space. It has to have a certain amount of parking. And that's really, I think, the goal here, that this community is more master planned in its whole versus like we're going to jam a bunch of houses into existing neighborhoods.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
not really what this is about,
I really like, just to add to the discussion, what you pointed out, that if we're talking about taking land that's not currently developed and has a requirement to have wide streets that I can't talk, to accommodate vehicles on either side of it comfortably, then that's a reasonable thing to be considering in the full parking picture, as opposed to things that might be infill in some of the existing areas. So it is a different
I know it's hard,
situation.
and part of it is we're kind of teasing out what this might look like, a real highlight. I know it's hard because we'll have to get more into detail, but that's really it. And I think even like having developers say, this is what we'd like to do, and then you guys could take a look at that, and that's obviously part of this process, with the goal in mind of a more affordability, but still maintaining largely, hopefully, the character of the community at the same time. It's a tough balancing act, because it does look different. It looks different, but I don't know if we have really good examples, to be honest with you, in this community of what we're talking about. And so people visualize like, oh my God, I don't want it to look like X, and then whatever that is. But I think what we're hoping to get to is something that is more like in line with Canby kind of vibe and character. That's part of it, but there is these kind of compromise situations that also have to go with that to get to the affordability factor as well. I think there's definitely a creativity element here as well. I don't think every developer, this is not going to be every developer that takes advantage of this. It's going to be ones that actually want to create a unique product, which we're hoping ends up, being really valuable for the community and getting more people to entry-level home buying.
Do we have very much latitude to be really prescriptive in what those creative criteria are? Because sometimes it seems like, well, the state has these parameters that you need to work within. That seems like it could limit the ideal outline of what we would be presenting and saying, we want you to include these.
I think we can talk about like common areas. I mean, what in my mind on like cottage developments, even on planned unit developments, we're talking about it's not like every development, you don't automatically get this. You have to create something like, what's the common elements there? Is it an open space? Is it a trail system? What is that gives that uniqueness, and it's more of a planned community? Commissioner Hutchins?
One of the things, well, I mean, in addition to consolidating parking, which cuts down on all of your non-permeable surfaces, but it's like, what about your trash collection? So it's like, it seems to me that one of the things that you can kind of gain with a community like that is that, you've got a centralized dumpster enclosure, or, something that, where you just have one truck that comes into one location and then it leaves, and you don't have to require that the roads or, the paths that go out to all the individual structures can support such a vehicle, and, it seems like, that kind of comes under like I mean, no more complicated than an HOA, or something like a condominium development or something like that, where you just consolidate things in certain places. And I think that, that's one of the ways that you could probably make these things attractive is by, getting as much of the busyness of owning a home, all centralized into one spot, so that the place where you're actually staying is fairly quiet and, kind of away from the busyness of the roadway.
But people's physical ability to move their trash from point A to dumpster kind of comes into play in terms of like who can own that home then? Is it only very young, able-bodied people? It can't be available to retirees or people who have some kind of like physical disability? Because
There was a very nice hillside one that he showed as part of the examples that, I'm not sure how that would work,
Yeah, and I'm not saying that centralized trash isn't a good idea. I think
No, I agree
if
with
it's
you
planned well, it
completely.
could be, but I would never want to just let everybody do that, because then it's like these are only available to like a really specific subset, which might not be as inclusive as we'd be hoping to be with affordability and the cottage cluster.
And we do have some discretion. I mean, obviously, I think part of that is, the parameters, and we'll talk more about those, but getting, we'll get more to scale of what this looks like. But I mean, I don't think that we want to encourage something that doesn't provide consistency with the imagery that we've already seen. I mean, again, we're just starting this kind of deeper dive, but I think the products that you've seen in those visuals, that really is the goal in the end. Now, what the code looks like to support that, it's going to be more than just the open space, but there's other elements. The challenge on some of this is the discretionary level. Obviously, the more discretion you provide on projects, the more expensive they become. That's typically where that's at in terms of like design and materials and those kinds of things is what I'm talking about. That may not be something the code gets into that level of detail, but I mean, that versus like, the general layout and how it's constructed. And I mean, I think we have development standards, and then there's design elements that can be considered as well. Clearly, I think the starting point is, what are those amenities that define a cottage development, first of all? Like, I'd like to start with that, because I mean, that's what it is. The commonality of that, in my opinion, is what makes it a cottage development. And then from there, it's like having lots that are arranged in a way that enhance that feature. There could be a garden in the middle of this. There could be, a lake in the middle of this. There could be, trails around it, but something that actually makes this like a community that feels like it's somewhat integrated. Oftentimes in neighborhoods, we wall ourselves off and put fences around each other. That's not what this cottage development, I think, is. It's more about a common experience. Yeah.
So could we say that one of like the base tenets of any cottage development would be it's taking currently undeveloped land in R1 or R1.5 and then going from there in presenting a proposal with a minimum amount of acreage or whatever? So this would be limited to.
Exactly. I mean, it'd be a subset, and again, we don't know exactly what this looks like, but it'd be a subset where you'd have R1 and R1.5 in that zoning, and there'd be perhaps either, like Reed was talking about, either a carve out in that zone saying, here's the cottage development section that you'd have the minimum qualifications to meet that, or the cottage development ordinance could be a standalone ordinance. But yes, to your point, there would be parameters around that, and that's really the focus here. I mean, that's different than like an infill ordinance that we don't really have in place now, and that's not something we're proposing really either, although Emma's going to talk about the current code and what you could do inside of like larger lots. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And great comments and right on cue with this last bullet, which is, as Don was mentioning, that really trying to make sure that we're doing what we need to address DLCD's concerns about parking and not mandating high off-street parking requirements. Next slide, please. And you can just advance to the next slide. Thank you. So another aspect of the code that we're going to be taking a look at is the PUD ordinance, and and how are cottage clusters addressed within PUD scenarios. The city's PUD ordinance is pretty prescriptive right now in terms of not allowing unit types or areas to exceed the base zones that comprise that PUD. And so I think we would want to take a look at that to see if there's some loosening up of those requirements within the PUD ordinance to potentially allow for a little bit more of a broader distribution of uses that are allowed within the zones that are a part of that, and the unit types that would be spread around within that site. I didn't realize we had the animation backwards. That caught me up. So with and then another thing that we'll be taking a look at are, do we look at kind of a combination, is there a combination of a standard subdivision and a PUD needed to accommodate the cottage cluster, or is it purely within, is there a kind of a straight path forward approach within your subdivision ordinance to allow for cottage clusters? I think likely there would probably be both, so that there's a clear and objective path to allow the cottage clusters. And then the benefit to that concept of allowing the distribution of unit types within the PUD is just having a greater diversity of housing types and layouts within that PUD. Like I was referring to, so with the PUD ordinance, the way that it's currently structured, there's some limitations in terms of how your density can be assigned and distributed. So I think that there would probably be a need potentially to exceed the underlying maximum density to some degree, and I think there'll need to be a discussion about what are the circumstances and to what extent would that be allowed, and is there a greater open space requirement, a different sort of composition of your amenities within the open space, or under what circumstances and to what degree is there a density increase allowed for that product type. And again, the benefit is just to accommodate the cottage clusters with the limitations on the PUD densities right now. I'm not sure that you could get to the generally 9 to 12 units per acre that the projects that we've seen accomplish with those cottage clusters. Whereas in your R1 and R5 zones, you're looking at a maximum of 4.5 units to 6 units to the acre. So there's a gap there between what the cottage clusters are achieving and what your maximum densities are allowing. And so there's going to need to be some discussion about how does that gap get addressed, and how much do we boost the allowed densities to try to get into that zone where the cottage clusters are really accomplishing that 10 units to the acre average roughly. And then your PUD ordinance, interestingly, has some pretty prescriptive requirements for open space that require connections to offsite properties, and of the PUD ordinances I've seen, it's one of the more rigid and prescriptive ordinances when it comes to open space and the orientation and how it's integrated into the communities. I think when you introduce a cottage cluster, I think there'll need to be some discussion about how does that cottage cluster open space relate to your current open space requirements, and do we look at it as a set aside and a kind of another aspect of that PUD, or is there some change to the way that the PUD open space requirements are structured to consider integrating open space networks, trails to the common open space in the cottage clusters. So I think we'll need to think about, is there a separate open space requirement for the cottage clusters that's different than the PUD open space, and/or how do those two integrate or intersect at some point?
And just to add to that, Commissioner Driscoll, this would be another item that you had mentioned. So there'd be another set of parameters. We'll need to differentiate cottage development criteria from PUD development criteria. You could have a cottage cluster within a PUD as well. This is where it gets complicated. But the idea is, again, these are greenfield, largely greenfield areas. What are the sizes of them? One consideration would be on planned unit developments would be some percentage of the overall lots that would be allowed to be attached, like in condominium style or townhome style within a larger PUD. Both of them, I think, would have, both cottage developments and PUDs would have some common open space or amenities with them that would qualify them as those type of projects. So I think there's still some more layers to peel back here on this, but again, I think there's another tool here, like you might see more traditional home sizes, and then you may have townhomes tucked into a PUD. That might be one concept, and then cottage developments might look different. They may be all like smaller lots with common open space areas around those. Commissioner Hutchinson?
Can you see, I mean, just separating the criteria by the numbers of units, or the, I mean, like below an acre, it's a cottage cluster, and above an acre, it's a PUD, and that's where your rules change?
I mean, it's typically what you see is, and Reed can weigh in on this too, I mean, my visual is probably 5-10 acres is cottage development, and then maybe above 10 acres is PUD. I mean, that would be, these are larger developments. These are not single lots. Yeah, this is a more planned development concept. Yeah, I think the smaller lots really, again, the infill stuff is already kind of covered in the current code.
So maybe even a minimum number of units for a cottage cluster then?
There would be allowed, and that would be, and again, with what parameters, what amenities would that have to have that qualifies it as that? So you could still have the same base zone, back to the example in Austin, but instead of a universal change where everybody has now like really small lot ability, you would only be able to get there through the ability to like go through the process and the criteria. Does this project meet or does it not meet the criteria? And that would be a qualifier. So.
Next slide, please. So for the next phase of work, these are some of the issues that we would expect to be working with the city and with the commission as we dig a little deeper. So, what are the allowed use and design standards that need to be included to accommodate cottage clusters? How can the code offer greater design flexibility while ensuring quality design? Kind of speaking to Don's last point, I think there are different ways that we've seen codes address that. There's often sort of a prescriptive path that says these are as a kind of foundation, these are the things that we want to see in a cottage cluster development, that if you meet these prescriptive standards, then you're down a kind of clear and objective path. If for whatever reason the circumstances don't lend themselves to applying these specific standards, then maybe there's an alternate path that affords some discretion, working with the commission to seek an approval on that. So I think there's some different ways that we can get there, but I think teasing that out will be an important part of this next step. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. Has our POD or PUD ordinance changed since Hope Village was built? Is it the same as it was then?
I believe, I don't know how long Hope Village has been there, and I'm not sure what that process was that was used for.
Wasn't that the last PUD development built here? I think it was.
Was that Laney? Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, never mind.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm just curious. And then would we ever be in a situation where we could work with a developer of a subdivision and say, well, if you're going to build a subdivision, then within it, you need 2 cottage clusters as a requirement of a subdivision build out? Is that something cities do?
And I'll let Reed speak to this as well. I'm not sure if the laws in Oregon really allow that.
Okay.
As a condition. I mean, some states are pretty prescriptive about, like, they've gone fairly heavy on planning processes and what you can and cannot do with those. I'm not aware of anything that could mandate that. This is more like an incentive base, like,
Yeah.
here, you can do a traditional development on this property. Here's your yield, and they'll do their math on that. But you could do this other option and perhaps have a higher yield and also achieve more affordable housing. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't ever seen it mandated like that, but kind of to what Don was saying, how I see that addressed more often is that, say you're in a PUD and you're needing a variance from a particular standard, then often there will be like a community, we will consider allowing this if you meet one of these 5 community benefit standards. And one of those community benefit standards could be something like innovative design, such as a cottage cluster consistent with our cottage cluster ordinance. So I think that it'd probably be more incentive-based.
And this is only kind of adjacent, but something I've been curious about. Does anybody ever regulate window size of buildings? Because, do we regulate that at all? Because sometimes you see these teeny little windows. There's this big, flat, 3-story wall, and then there's like 2 tiny windows that you couldn't fit out of to save your life. I'm like, that's hideous. Just personally, I don't like the aesthetics of it.
And largely, no, other than the design review areas in Canby, which is more the downtown. Clearly, the downtown area, you have a glazing requirement, so you see
More
that
of a
the windows,
safety
60%. And that's a requirement that is in the urban area, but we don't have any design standards really for housing. I think the hope is that, like, if people are going to go to the extent of going through these incentive processes, that they're all in and not, marginalizing the windows of their home. But for a market factor anyway, that would be, I know what you're saying. I'm not sure if it's easily regulated to go to that level. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think the next couple of bullets, we've sort of drifted into these discussions in our already, but just to what extent are cottage clusters allowed through that kind of prescriptive path and clear and objective path and a standard subdivision versus PUD. That's something we'll need to work through. And then again, to what degree is greater density allowed to accommodate the cottage clusters, and then what should be the criteria for this? So shifting to looking at the commercial areas of the city along 99E, some of the concepts that in areas of potential code adjustments that we identified were, first of all, the code in C1 currently limits the amount of area devoted to ground floor residential to less than 25% of the overall ground floor gross area, and so I think that's an area that we would want to explore potentially changing, and that we'd be looking at with this update. And another possibility would be to look at adding zero lot line development to allow for abutting development, directly abutting buildings on lots within that district, and potentially accessory dwellings to uses permitted outright. And of course, benefit is just what we're striving for, which would be to reduce the barriers to have housing, some degree of housing in those districts.
Would you mind repeating that? The last one?
Thank you.
Commissioner Driscoll, did you have a question on that last slide, or just?
Yeah, Just zero lot line development in general. I just want to make sure I'm soaking that all up.
Yeah.
And this would be, the focus really is on south side of 99, not the north side, which is already, more like Dahlia development. This would be more where you have a commercial building, and currently it's pretty challenging to have any mix of housing in that area based on the current codes. This would be a way to kind of promote that, and whether or not there'd be a zero lot line or not, but it's in commercial, so you'd have commercial to commercial basically is what you'd be having. So this is not commercial to residential. So within commercial areas, there would be more flexibility is what we're talking about, to allow some infill of residential within commercial areas.
Well, all the commercial areas butt up against residential areas, and it's all real close to 99 where they've got particularly narrow streets and not really any parking on the streets for everything that's already there and going in.
And I think to your point, I mean, obviously that's another level that we can dive into where there is a budding residential. Clearly there would be articulated standards that we could address there as well. So it's another consideration. It may not result in a ton of housing, but currently the code doesn't really promote it in any way. So it's just another opportunity to provide additional housing that would be more affordable based on the population that's forecasted to need that housing in Canby.
I'd love to see the map, the zoning map of exactly where the C1 and C2 areas that would be affected are.
And we did, sorry, we don't have that tonight, but we did have a slide, I think, in the last work session, and we'll,
Multiple times.
I need to
yeah,
print it out
and it's
carry it around
it's a
with me.
relatively small area that we've looked at. Again, it's another way of like looking at ways to create housing, which is in bad need.
So one area of change that we think would warrant some consideration is just reducing minimum yard requirements. Obviously, in the more kind of urban context, and trying to potentially create a little bit more room for residential, having reduced yard requirements, reduced setbacks to allow the buildings to be up a little bit closer to the sidewalks, a little bit more pedestrian accessibility in terms of design would be something that we think would merit some consideration. Same thing goes for maximum lot coverage. Again, if we can structure the code in a way that there's sufficient parking available, and these sites can sustain themselves when it comes to the kind of operations of the commercial and residential uses, it seems that we could potentially dial back some of that maximum lot coverage requirement for the buildings on the lots, and potentially allow those footprints to grow to allow a little bit more room on the sites for residential.
Reed, can I ask you a question about the benefit on the first concept there? The sub-bullet is saying that the future of Highway 99 is not to be a car-centric corridor. Where is that coming from? I can't see how 99 is not going to continue to be car-centric, especially if they start tolling on 205, because we're going to see a lot of diverted traffic from that.
Yeah, and I think that's probably not phrased.
Yeah.
I think it's more about maybe some of the side streets off of Highway 99, not necessarily, and I think it was more about the sort of commercial corridor, not Highway 99 itself. So I think that's a good catch.
So you're thinking that just the streets around, like off of my understanding of the commercial zones, to the best of my recollection, which is not necessarily going to be 100% accurate, the commercial zones on 99 don't go very deep. They're only like 1 or 2 blocks.
Right.
So you've got 99 on one side, you've got Second on the other side, you've got Third, and that's pretty much it. So we would be thinking that Second and Third would not be car-centric corridors. Like, what else could it be if not 99?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thought is that, and Don, I don't know if you have other thoughts on this, but, I think where we're coming from on that is by enabling residential there and allowing for more, immediate access, kind of walkable communities to, get your everyday goods, that you would be facilitating more of a walkable environment. And I think you're right, just proximity to 99 is always going to have a high degree of vehicle use. It's inevitable. I think probably it's not phrased as well as it should be, and I think it should have been that it would sort of reduce vehicle dependence by integrating more mixed use there.
And just to comment on that, I don't disagree, Commissioner Driscoll, that it is a car-centric 99E. I think to Reed's point, and again, good catch, because we're not trying to make it it'd be great if it could be less car-centric, but you're
It would
right,
be
with
lovely.
diversion, et cetera. But I think maybe I can help out here.
Okay.
In terms of what Reed was mentioning. I think over time, that area is going to change. We've had a number of food cart applications, and some of them are on 99. Those have not materialized yet. I think the dynamic of that will become more, it'll change over time, and when you start to see those things like food carts and other activities like that along 99, it becomes, the character becomes different. And there still may be a lot of vehicle traffic, but I think it's more of a character issue, and that needs to be rewarded. So I just want to acknowledge that, and we'll change that text. But I think the idea is that it's becoming more livable instead of less livable, even though there's a lot of traffic on 99, if that's something that's understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good catch.
Yeah.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
comment. Okay, sorry, next bullet, please. So, and this next one is just, again, parking. Obviously, parking is a huge topic with any of these measures that look to maybe create a little bit more room on sites for people use, not car use. And so that would be a part of the discussion, and the evaluation would be to what degree should parking standards be looking at available off-site and other options. And then, what's the proper orientation of parking when it is on-site? Should we be looking for those to be potentially located a little bit more behind the buildings or to the side, and allow for greater street orientation of the buildings on the sites?
So streets other than 99 to try and encourage people to walk through the neighborhoods beyond that, or focusing it on 99?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Next bullet, please. And then I think we've covered that one. And then another concept that we think would warrant some consideration is shared parking, and looking at the ability to share parking between the uses. If we are introducing a little bit more residential into that area, allowing for situations where you have uses that have altering peak operating hours, altering peak parking hours, allowing for shared parking in those situations.
And just to comment on that, we do allow shared parking now, but let's say, for example, a florist, 8 to 5 florist is on 99E, and there's residential also on that property. The question that we're trying to grapple with is, should there be, parking at the maximum for both uses, or should there be some reduction in that? And we can bring forth other information about that issue, but when you have off-peak hour situations that are like that, it seems like that would be worth exploring a little further. It may end up resulting in us, both uses have to end up having exactly what is required for their independent uses, but sometimes you get a lot more parking than you need if they're off-peak.
And does that happen with, like, individual permits on cars, or are they then you looking at code enforcement, which we don't do?
I think part of this would be, I wouldn't say this would be a large-scale situation, but maybe there's some parameter on percentage of reduction. Let's say it's 10 or 20% reduction where there's shared parking, and it's based on, I mean, right now in the code, Planning Commission has the authority right now to basically alter parking standards
Right.
if there's evidence that's provided to that effect. This is a way to maybe quantify that further so it's less challenging later on, like do you or do you not even meet the parameters of what was thought to be the reduction.
Okay.
But this is a little conceptual, I understand, but it's another thing that we thought would be worth exploring.
Okay.
As a concept, it sounds intriguing on the surface, but then when you stop and think about rising housing prices, that's just going to mean more people working to afford the same small space, which ultimately I think means they're going to need that parking just to accommodate the people who live in the places nearby. So in the immediate term of implementation, it would probably be sufficient, but long-term, it would probably just balloon into a congested.
And I wouldn't say this is a fatal flaw item. I mean, this is probably one that it just felt like we didn't want this to be later on like, hey, we're
Why didn't we
pointing
talk
this
about it?
out, but like,
Yeah.
this is full disclosure. These are items that I think would be at least worth considering. Yeah.
And I think, obviously, the whole context of this is housing efficiency measures and ways to do that. But I think ideally there will be things like that or other things that are uncovered in the code that, while you've opened the book, there might be some opportunities for some adjustments here and there to tackle other things that pop up that the commission's interested in covering. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide that I have before Emma's portion of the presentation is up, but this is just a quick summary of what we would intend to cover in the work scope with this 99E commercial section of it, looking at allowed use and design standards to allow for some mixed use and really segregated mixed use potentially as well, not necessarily vertically integrated, but horizontally integrated mixed use. And, considering allowing ground floor dwellings beyond just what's incidental or less than 25% of other ground floor uses. And then considering, building scale and lot coverage requirements and setback requirements that might need to adjust to better accommodate that sort of horizontal mixed use scenario that we're thinking is, something that the city should be considering. So any questions on that or any other portion of the presentation?
And just to add on these items, we're going to have Emma present on in the infill, the current standards on infill, and to go through that. We're probably going to be, we'll be working with Dow on the details of their scope and coming back with more detailed text for the scope of work and running that through the Planning Commission. That would likely happen in September, so the month of August will be largely getting the details identified, but we're going to continue with the same dialogue. Hopefully you guys aren't getting worn out on these topics, because we're just kind of beginning this process. And this will run through the next several months in September, going through probably the end of the year and perhaps even into next year. So this is not one and done.
I get to repeat myself too,
Yes.
right? I'm down with hearing it over
Yeah.
and over again. I'm starting to catch it all, but I'll probably say the same things over
Well,
and
and
again
it's
too.
a lot to take in, and I guess the one thing that would be helpful for us is what will make this more clear and defined for you all, and that would be more clear and defined for the public. So it's clear as to what we're doing and perhaps even what we're not doing. I think there's a tendency for planning to be somewhat abstract and not understood. So that would be something that would be helpful for us in this process as we move this forward, is please don't hesitate to say, it would be really helpful if I saw X to,
I can throw something out there.
Yeah.
If we could just get kind of a draft bullet point list of what criteria we need to be defining. We need to define the size, the allowable X, Y, and Z of the different things that are going to make up the overall code on what you would need from us. And if you have specific proposals, as a correlation to each of those bullet points, here are some of the proposed options that we think we should be considering. That would be a good jumping off point for us to kind of determine, like, what do we think of that and what ones do we want to focus on first in our discussions and kind of hashing things out.
thank you, great. We'll have a chance for other comments, so keep your, if you don't have anything right now, Emma, I'm going to have you come up and switch with you.
Oh, Lainey, can you actually change it? Sorry. We're gonna jump out into a different procedure, but we'll come back to yours if that's okay.
That's why I think I'm done.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah.
wasn't sure if you had any extra.
No.
If I was sandwiched in there. Okay. Hello, everyone. I don't believe I've met all the new commissioners. My name is Emma Porcolo. I'm an associate planner here at the city. As Don mentioned, I'm here tonight to discuss infill opportunities near downtown Canby. So we're kind of shifting gears from what we were just discussing and talking about existing residential neighborhoods, or generally a neighborhood here in Canby. This is based on earlier discussions about the infill possibilities near downtown and just trying to give some high-level quantifiable information on it. Next slide, please. So tonight we're reviewing, like I said, understanding the infill opportunities in R1 areas north of downtown Canby to allow for an additional detached dwelling unit. This is particularly intended to be in older neighborhoods of town that have older houses and generally larger lots, not so much the newer subdivisions we're seeing. This exercise is only focused on detached single-family homes on an existing lot. We're not focusing on ADUs in this exercise for a couple of reasons. One being those standards have existed for a while and we haven't seen a ton of production of those. And just from a desirability standpoint, we believe that this is kind of what we think most people would find desirable in the community, and is meeting the goals of the HNA and the efficiency measures to create more home ownership options, whereas an ADU, technically in a really convoluted way, you could purchase it, but it's not really a home ownership opportunity.
Emma, could I add something
Yeah.
real briefly? Sorry, probably should have introduced this a little bit. Commissioner Ewert was wanting us to, he did the walk by where he's walking through the neighborhood, and boy, there's a ton of vacant properties that could have houses on them. And I'm walking through town, and why do we need to do an urban growth boundary expansion? Because there's so many vacant lots. And if we only filled all those lots with homes, we wouldn't have a demand for housing. So that's kind of the basis, the impetus of this discussion tonight, which is what the current code allows for infill. And to Emma's point, it's correct. There's several pieces of our code that address this, and more recently is House Bill 2001, which allows people to put two homes on one lot. It's a state law. That's easier said than done. And so Emma's going to walk us through this process of what the current code allows. We're not proposing any changes to the code, but we're pointing out some of the challenges that are in existence with infill. And we are asking a high-level question, which is, should we be doing more to create the opportunity for greater infill? Just on the surface of it, it is rather complicated to do infill. It's way easier to walk by a lot and say, that's a big lot. It'd be really easy to put a house on it. It's a lot harder to do that. People put homes on their property for a specific reason back in the day. They were never thinking about putting another home on their lot, so they put it in a location typically that makes it really challenging. There's financing issues that are challenging as well with that, and then there's division of property issues that are challenging. So this is really, in essence, to look at the scenario of a slice of Canby, and I think largely to identify that it is super challenging, and the yield that will happen from infill is rather small based on current code. Then the question back to the Planning Commission is, do you want to entertain us looking at incentives to intensify that or not? That would be things like reducing setbacks. This is not part of our efficiency measures that we're proposing so far. This is not on the list. So those are cottage developments, planned unit developments, and the commercial, allowing residential in the commercial areas, specifically on south side of 99E. So, Emma, sorry, I thought that'd be helpful just as a context. So take it away, please.
Yes, so I just want to reiterate that this exercise only looked at creating new detached single-family homes by creating a new tax lot. So basically splitting an existing tax lot into two. Do you have a question?
Really quick, with HB 2001, is there a minimum lot size for putting 2 dwellings on one lot?
Yes, there is. So what we're reviewing today is actually not those are not a product of HB 2001. Those could have occurred prior to. But yes, there is. Basically, the rule of thumb is everything in House Bill 2001, every single-family detached duplex standards have to be the same. So single-family home minimum lot size is 7,000 square feet. Now duplexes, we cannot require them to have a minimum lot size of no more than 7,000 square feet. So we can't say you have 2 lots, so you need to double the lot size. That's what HB 2001 prohibits. Yeah, so it has to be one and the same, basically.
Thank you.
So the approach, I'm calling this an exercise because this was a very, preliminary, high-level look. This was not a very in-depth analysis. This was me looking at aerial imagery and tax lot data to kind of determine some potential opportunities. But again, keep in mind, high-level. And so today, I present to you with a small study area that we looked at and the opportunities within that area that I found, and then I'll also show you an example of a potential scenario of a partition where this could happen. Next slide, please. So this is the study area that we looked at. This is the southern edge of the R1 zone closest to downtown, bounded by the fairgrounds, to Birch on the west and 10th at the north. So a fairly older neighborhood of town with an interesting combination of tax lots. There's a lot of different sizes and configurations here. So a lot of different opportunities. Next slide, please. So just reiterate, the methodology was to use aerial imagery to determine infill opportunities. There's some assumptions that I want to share up front. The infill is creating new single-family detached homes, as I already said. Existing structures were considered impediments here, so none of these opportunities consider moving existing structures, including garages, sheds, pools, those kinds of things. New lots, as I mentioned, the minimum lot size in the R1 zone is 7,000 square feet. There is a carve out in the code that under very certain conditions, Planning Commission can permit a lot as small as 6,000 square feet, but that is not considered in this exercise. 7,000 is the minimum for this exercise. Lots must meet the maximum impervious surface, which is 60%. And where applicable, the infill lot standards apply, and I'll note where those are coming into play. Next slide, please. For ease of eyes and details, I broke the study area up into 4 areas, and so this map here is just showing the different sections that I created. Next slide. So for each of the areas, the blue outline shows tax lots that are 14,000 square feet. So is this tax lot even large enough to be divided? Does it just have the lot size? And so that's what's surrounded in blue, and then the ones with yellow highlighting in it are ones that I determined do have infill opportunities and can meet the standards. So as you see in this section, there's one house that is 14,000, or one lot, excuse me, that is 14,000 square feet, but it is configured in a way that does not allow it to be partitioned. Next slide, please. Here we have several more lots with more opportunities, some unique size lots, but there's only 2 lots that are available for infill opportunities, and I've noted there that one of the smaller ones, the house can only be 30 feet wide, and so that's fairly common. Looking at opportunities that create flag lots with meeting setbacks and it being a flag lot, these would have to be fairly narrow houses. Next slide. Again, several more lots with more opportunities, or that meet the minimum lot size, but only 3 lots have the opportunities. I think you'll notice, especially on Ivy, the southern half, there's a cluster of lots there, but a lot of the times, as Dawn mentioned, these houses were not designed to be partitioned, so the house is a way that it takes up so much of the frontage that you can't fit a driveway and a setback in there. And I'll get into kind of all the impediments that I found along the way at the end. Next slide, Lainey. And again, this area here, there are several tax lots that meet the minimum lot size requirement, but they do not have, they're not able to be partitioned for various reasons. Next slide, please. And so this here is an example of one of the lots that I found that could accommodate infill via partition. It is on Northeast 9th Avenue. The existing site area is just above 14,000 square feet, and the existing house is a little bit above 2,000 square feet. So the blue lines show the existing house dimensions. Red shows setbacks. So the existing house, you need to have a 20-foot setback in the rear. You wouldn't need a 20-foot setback on the side, but you need to meet a lot size. So there's kind of some shifting happening here to meet, so that both lots meet the minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet. As you see, the buildable area is fairly narrow again, and the red lines up there do show the required setbacks of 7 feet on the side yard and 20 feet for rear and driveway yard, we'll call it. So the proposed lot area would be just above 7,000 square feet with about a 2,800 square foot buildable area. That would seem to accommodate and meet the maximum impervious surface allowed with having the driveway come all the way up to meet the house at the back of the flag lot. The maximum building height is limited to 28 feet, which is 2 feet below a standard house in the zone, and that is where infill standards come in and limit the height of the house. And just a note that this was drawn to scale. Next slide, please, Lainey. So the results are there was almost 400 tax lots in the study area. Only 5 of those tax lots had opportunities to be partitioned to meet the current standards and to not shift any of the existing structure, accessory structures. So it's a very low number. It is 1% of the study area had this infill opportunity to create a new single-family detached home on a separate lot. So very few opportunities in this one area. Again, kind of looking back at the scenario, these are very tight lots and it would be very tightly configured just to make things fit, even within these very few possibilities. Next slide, please. Other way, please. So several observations in doing this exercise. Some of these bullets might look fairly familiar to what Reed had mentioned before. Again, these are not necessarily, we're not proposing code amendments right now. These are just me acknowledging the impediments that I found in this exercise. So Many homes don't have sufficient space to allow both a drive access and meet the side yard setback. So you need a minimum driveway width of 12 feet plus a 7-foot side yard setback. And most lots may be deep enough but don't have enough side space for that on the side of the house. The 7,000 square foot lot size is also a large impediment. It's hard to achieve, to find a second lot to make it 7,000 square feet and have both lots, work out perfectly where you can fit everything and meet the setbacks and have them both be 7,000 square feet. If it was 5,000 square feet for infill, I think there would be a lot more opportunities that could be found in this exercise. And that any of the partitions that are not flag lots would require 60 feet of frontage. And so a lot of corner lots, there seemed to be opportunities, but once you required 60 feet of frontage, that's when it was unable to meet the standards and could not be partitioned. This exercise was done in an older neighborhood of town, and just with experience, and if you look at aerial imagery of our newer neighborhoods, most of these houses are maxing out their lots, and this is not something that we could replicate in other areas. So just reiterating that, there was few opportunities in this area, and many of the other neighborhoods in town likely wouldn't be able to accommodate any of these. Next slide.
And I just wanted to add a few things. So the reason for the exercise, again, as part of the housing needs analysis, there's a buildable lands analysis, and the buildable lands analysis did not assume much of any infill to occur. This has been proven out in part both by what Emma's provided, but also with the underlying assumptions that FCS group provided on the housing needs analysis. And it's very challenging, I think, to have conversion and do these infills, and for a variety of reasons that Emma provided. What this all means for buildable lands analysis is, and these numbers are still being reviewed, and the housing needs analysis will come back before the Planning Commission for review and then recommendation onto the council. And that will have finalized numbers in it, but at this very point, we're probably between 50 and 112 acres of urban growth boundary expansion need for residential. So that's kind of where this all goes, is we look at things like efficiency measures, we look at, the state requires us to look at this. It also provides more housing affordability within Canby, which we obviously know based on the housing needs analysis that there is a need across the spectrum for different types of housing products that are some of them are not available here currently, and to provide more opportunity for those. So it looks at both, product type, and it looks at the need. And so the efficiency measures, the state requires us to go through that exercise to say, are you efficiently using your land that's here now in a way that minimizes your urban growth boundary expansion request? So the efficiency measures, again, that the Canby is proposing is the cottage development, planned unit development, and the commercial changes to allow more residential in those areas. Those three have been discussed with Department of Land Conservation and Development. As I mentioned, they'll be more involved in this process and likely be in work sessions in the future. Time-wise on this, it's looking probably like end of year, beginning of next year before this starts to go through the hearing process. So we're a ways out from that. But that housing needs is an important element for the city. And this is based on a 20-year population projection of about 6,000 more residents based on Portland State University projections. And then that's been formulated in the housing needs analysis to about 2,300 units, housing units, a variety of different types of housing units. And so there's more discussion on that. Commissioner Ewert, again, we'll have to bring him up to speed, but it may be perception that we just put a bunch of houses in bigger lots. The reality is it's not so easy to do. And it's reflected in the housing needs analysis and the projections of what the city will need in terms of additional land that's not part of the city limits right now. It would be part of a urban growth boundary expansion. So just some context. I think Emma was able to kind of dive more deeply into this. Those code provisions are in place. They've been in place for 2 years. We just do not see a lot of infill in Canby. And so one of the questions, I mean, back to the planning commissioners is, should there be other changes or should we be focusing on the other efficiency measures? It's more of a question just to throw out there to the commission, since Commissioner Ewert wanted us to kind of dive into like this infill discussion. So just another item.
I think Commissioner Ewert was looking at that also in the context of defining alleyways, because he saw that, I think if I remember correctly, he kind of saw the issues as linked, because if we're going to start changing setbacks, then we need to figure out what the heck we're doing with alleyways and what do they mean across the city and how come some are dirt and how come some are paved and yada, yada. So I think for less than, 1% of our available land, I don't know if it's something we want to tackle first, but I think we'd want to tackle it eventually, just to accommodate the alleyway discussion, you know what I mean?
And there are other, and part of the housing production strategies, which will be part of the housing needs analysis, a separate document. There are other elements to that which talk about other measures that we haven't addressed yet, and we'll be going through those. That could probably fit into one of those objectives, the other ones. Again, over the city on these processes on housing production strategy, it's over 8 years is the process there where you adopt it and you're supposed to implement these over 8 years. So that's part of the housing production strategy. So that could be deferred. Staff's not really taking a strong position either way, but we felt like it was important to vet this issue so there's not this misperception that if you only infilled the entire city, it would resolve the problem. It will not, is the end result.
So, Don,
Yeah.
so I guess it seems to me you'd almost have to take this by a case-by-case basis. Number one, and you're assuming that all these people would want to do this.
Well, and we're not
How realistic is that?
We're not making any assumptions, and we agree with you. And that's, again, we were not the ones that came up with the concept that it was something that was really viable. In fact, we had doubts to begin with. So we're taking the lead from the commission to, it's your, you guys are leading us and we're giving you information back. We never believed that it would yield a whole lot anyway, just observationally. Like I said, we might get 2 a year. And we didn't even, most of those are probably accessory dwelling units. They're probably not even a second home.
So is this something the state's, so are you convincing the state of this?
The state this is already the law. This has been the law for 2 years. Yeah. And this is House Bill 2001. So all we're giving you information from a request from Commissioner Ewert on what the viability would be for assuming there would be more lots that could be converted with the notion that we would need less urban growth boundary expansion area. That's essentially the equation.
So there are some lots that are really close to hitting those criteria. I think it should be looked at. But couldn't it be in a flexible situation? It could be case by case basis versus, we could really be going down a rat hole.
No, I agree. We agree on the diminishing returns.
Yeah.
It's just more like this kept coming up and we felt like we needed to address it and drill into a sample, and that sample showed that it's really difficult to do, which is not surprising since, like I said, we're only getting 2 applications a year, which is nothing hardly, maybe 1 or 2. So I would agree that our energy, I believe, should be spent elsewhere.
I just took it as an exercise in either proving or disproving the theory that this was the aha.
But I think there are some lots out there. I've known a couple of people, it's like,
Country clubs are one.
well, we won't go there right now. We'll leave the country club alone.
Sorry.
But some of those houses, though, it's really close. Can they bring the idea up and then, I mean, can they change, if it makes sense, can we change that?
Well, I mean, you have options to make it less restrictive. You do not have options to make it more restrictive.
Okay.
Because the state law
So I-
preempts the city's authority on this, and they went universal across the entire state. One of the few items that can be, is subject to, which, unlike the parking stuff, the climate change stuff that came up, we were not subject to. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see those lots that could potentially be, maybe that should be shared.
And there's an educational component to
Yeah.
one of the housing production strategies. That probably is the one that it fits into, which is, maybe there's educational material for people that are interested in that. It is a hard push, though, for a common homeowner when you figure how much that would be to build a home.
Yeah.
And anything reasonably sized would probably be in the $350,000 range. It'd probably be at that level. And you think about your own home, and then you'd have to divide the property off if you wanted to sell it.
And you'd have to deal with the underground utilities too. I was looking at the depths on some of those. I'm like, is that house even going to get grade on sewer, depending on where the asset is? Or now are we going to start doing party sewers? And I'm just like, that just sounds like a terrible.
I don't think the market is here in Canby. When land values go to a certain point, you start seeing conversion. I just do not see that at this point in Canby where the land values are that high that people are pushing the conversion, because
I don't think there's financial instruments available.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the major, if somebody wanted to knock down a ramshackle house and put in a duplex, I don't think banks have instruments for that right now unless you put down a significant chunk of cash.
Yeah, financing two homes on one lot is a big lift, to your point. Yeah.
Emma, thank you. I just want to say thanks. That was a lot of work. I appreciate the data. It was kind of nice to see it in print, quantified. I think we've solved the.
Should I go ahead and let's let Emma sit up there, and I'll do the planning commission, or the planning director's report, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's roll.
Okay. So just real quickly, just a few items. You've seen economic opportunity analysis. The other side of the housing need is the economic opportunity analysis need for additional land within the city for the next 20 years. That will be part of the comprehensive plan, the current comprehensive plan, and the hearing for that for Planning Commission is coming up on August 14th. The difference between what you saw before and recommended approval to council, the difference is we're now addressing the criteria for integrating it into the comprehensive plan. Nothing else has changed. The acreage has not changed. Your recommendations previously are all in there in terms of the additional items in there, and we'll go back through that again on the 14th, but that's coming up. That's the main hearing. I don't know if we have any hearings on August 28th. If we don't, we'll do another work session, and there'll be some topic that we've discussed, but maybe a deeper dive into that. We will have on August 16th, you guys heard from Ryan and Kelly Reed on sequential urban growth boundary process. That was at a work session previously. That is going to be going to council on August 16th, and that is essentially all the pieces that go with this comprehensive plan update and the elements and the work plan that goes with that. There's some advantages to doing that process because it separates out appealable items versus non-appealable items, and it also locks in the population growth rate from 2020, and we would not be subject to the new 2022 population growth rate. So that would lock that in. So more on that if you're interested on August 16th. I think those are the main items for right now, and we will also be applying for a Department of Land Conservation and Development grant as well, and that's an item that we will be discussing with the council on August 16th as well.
So do we, on the 28th, if there's no hearing, do we tackle a code-related item, or are we getting more into, just more in depth of this type of material?
We could dive into some code. Mainly and I know we have the fencing thing, which we've been buried. I know you guys don't want to do fencing, but that's, okay.
I think more than anything, actually, we want to bury the
Gotta
hatchet.
talk about alleys if you're talking about fencing.
Mr. Potter's up.
I think it's also possible we could have hearing items too. I just wanted to mention that.
Okay.
So,
Cool.
Thank you, Ryan.
so I don't think we would be canceling.
No,
Yeah.
I'm not alluding, you will be present. We will want you available. We don't have the topic, thank you, Ryan, but yeah, we have some hearings there's a backlog of hearings coming. I know it's been a long time since you've had a hearing on a project, but there are several that are in the queue. So that's what I know for right now.
Any highlights? Any sneak peeks? Too early to tell? No?
No, I don't
Lip
think.
sealed?
Yeah,
Dang it.
yeah, so that's it.
Okay,
So that's all I had.
very good. So when is the next meeting? 14th.
14th, yep.
So I have a question. What's the status of a council liaison? Do we wait until a new council member is installed, or we sign someone else?
I would need to get back to you on that. I don't know I know they're interviewing, or they will be interviewing. I don't know who is applied, but there's planned interviews anyway, assuming we have candidates, which I assume we will.
Well, there've been cases in the past where another existing council member steps up, but I don't know if that's planned or not.
So that, I'll have to get back
Okay,
to you.
it doesn't, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you, Reed. Appreciate it. Very informative again. Okay, barring any other comments or concerns, I think we'll entertain a motion.
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
I'll second.
Roll call vote, starting at this end, please.
Aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you very much.